This is Johnny, and you are listening to the Chubby Caucasian Christian Closeted Conservative. Some might say I'm everything wrong with the world, but don't take their word for it. Make up your own mind. Good morning, everybody, and welcome back. I wanted to take a break from the forgiveness ideal that I brought up in my previous episode. That is a concept that I'd like to come back to very frequently. It's one of my favorite conversations. One of my favorite political conversations to have is why we hold different people to different standards and compare and contrast, find similar stories, and what are the differences? Why do we hold these two people to different standards? But I wanted to spend a little time today and in future episodes is talking about this NPR podcast that I listen to. I listen to a decent amount of political podcasts just about every day, and I would like to think that I have a decent variety of liberal and conservative. Now, I had a liberal friend, after we had a discussion, suggest that I listen to an NPR podcast called Upfirst. This podcast is about 15 to 20 minutes long, and it comes out first thing in the morning every day, Monday through Friday, including Saturday, and then Sunday, it's a half an hour to an hour episode where they highlight or promote some sort of other NPR podcast. They play an episode or a commercial for a different NPR podcast. Now, I know this podcast, they only have 15 to 20 minutes, so they really do have to pick and choose the stories that they want to discuss. And occasionally, I would like to focus on the stories that they discuss and their perspective and point of view, and maybe point out some interesting ways or phrases that they tell a story, and then sometimes they never really come back to it. So let's just jump in to this NPR podcast.
I am Steve Astinky. This is Up First from NPR. And I got the news that you need to start your day.
So I started listening to this podcast in March of 2021, and right away I started noticing just interesting how it was, the stories that they picked and the perspectives that they took. So in April, I started to save some of the podcasts that I thought were a little outlandish. Now, towards the end of April, one story that Upfirst really liked to focus on was the story of Andrew Brown. And the episode that I really like to strongly highlight, but they played it several times, was the episode from April 27th. This was the day after the family of Andrew Brown and the attorney got to watch 20 seconds of the death of Andrew Brown. Now, before we even get into this, I'm really not here to discuss the Andrew Brown story itself. I'm really here to discuss how it was covered by this NPR podcast. When it comes to the Andrew Brown story, and this is just about as much as I'm going to touch on it, if you and I can't agree that violence and death are not good things and shouldn't happen, there are very little things you and I are going to agree on. So violence and death, just for the sake of violence and death, I think that we should be working towards a society where those things don't happen. And unfortunately, if you disagree with me, I think that says a lot about your character, and it's going to be very difficult for us to have a conversation if we can't just find that common ground. Now, after that, when we're talking about how do we work towards that society where there's less violence and death, and we have different opinions of how we can reach that, that is a totally different conversation than just us both saying violence and death are wrong and that they shouldn't happen. So I didn't want Andrew Brown to die here. Andrew Brown, in my opinion, should not be dead. There were decisions that he made and that the police officers made that led to this tragic event. Whether those decisions are right or wrong, I would like to cover that in a future episode. So for those who don't remember, Andrew Brown was shot on April 21st. His family was allowed to watch 20 seconds of the video on April 26th. And after they viewed the video, this is what the attorney and family came out and said about the video.
Let's be clear. This was an execution. Andrew Brown was in his driveway. Andrew had his hands on his steering wheel. He was not reaching for anything. He wasn't touching anything. He wasn't throwing anything around. He had his hands firmly on the steering wheel. They run up to his vehicle shooting. He still stood there, sat there in his vehicle with his hands on the steering wheel while being shot at.
Now, this audio clip, NPR, this Upfirst podcast must have played this audio clip at least twice. I want to say a third time, possibly a fourth time. But within that time frame, after the family saw it and before it was released publicly, they played it a couple of times. The way this attorney describes the events that happened that day, I believe is not an accurate description of what happened. And once the video was released to the public, Upfirst never talked about this story again. They never mentioned it again. I would encourage you, if you're over the age of 18, to go watch the video and see if their attorney's description of those events accurately describes what you see. The way I would have described the events on that day was the police officers are in the back of a pickup truck. They pull up to a house, which is supposedly a drug house. They get out of the vehicle. Now, as soon as they get out of the vehicle, I didn't hear a gunshot. The attorney said as soon as the police officers got out of the vehicle, they were shooting. I didn't hear that. The body camera footage, unfortunately, there's like a second or two where it looks at the ground, and you can tell that the vehicle is moving. However, it's not clear what the vehicle is actually doing. It looks like from our point of view that the vehicle might be going backwards. And it's difficult to tell if there's an officer back there already or not. But what is very obvious to see is the car starts to go forward, and it comes very close to hitting an officer. Now, when I hear it, I don't hear a bullet get shot during this point. And if a round was fired at this moment, when the police officer is touching the hood of the vehicle as the vehicle is coming towards him, I really think we would have had a different conversation. But what happens is it appears that the vehicle is going to clear all of the officers, and that's when we start hearing the first shots. Now, some of the reports that I've read says that the first shot came through the windshield, the front of the vehicle. In the direction, there's a house on the other side, and there at one point is a vehicle that appears to drive on the street in the direction that the officers are shooting. I do not completely agree with that decision, and I think it would have been relevant if the attorney described it that way. Now, however, they only saw 20 seconds, so maybe they saw different video or it didn't go that far. One thing, though, however, I will say about the claims this attorney made was she said Andrew Brown was not doing anything. Now, I don't believe that is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. The vehicle was moving and he was in the driver's seat. She also said that his hands were on the steering wheel, and even while he was being shot at, they were on the steering wheel. Now, I'm just a chubby Caucasian Christian closeted conservative, but the visualization that I had when I heard her make those comments was that he was sitting in the driveway, white-knuckled on the steering wheel, never turned the steering wheel, never hit the gas pedal, nothing. When in fact, that is not an accurate description. Maybe Andrew Brown did not palm the steering wheel as he was clearing the police officers, but the attorney made it sound like he was just sitting there in the vehicle, which I don't think is an accurate description of what actually happened. Now, one thing that I will say about this NPR episode, and all the majority of the ones where they talked about this case, there was another audio clip of individuals that they were interviewing who were marching and protesting. And one of the gentlemen that they interviewed, he kept saying that he, was peaceful, but that he was going to the courthouse because they needed to release the tape. And I tell you what, if I was in the area and I felt like an American flag would have been accepted at that march, I would have been right down there with them. That seems like a reasonable thing to protest. Why aren't we showing the coverage? And NPR, this NPR podcast, Up First, never answered that question. They just interviewed people, and people were saying they won't release the coverage. We don't know why they won't release the coverage. It took me 30 seconds to find out why they didn't release the coverage immediately. North Carolina law, a judge has to approve the release of the footage to the public. Now, North Carolina law doesn't prohibit showing the coverage to the family, which is what happened a couple days after. However, if NPR is the only way you were getting your news or any sort of current events, you might have been a little confused and angry and frustrated with the story if you just took this at NPR's word. And since the coverage has been released to the public, NPR has never touched the story again. They have never talked about it again. That woman, their attorney, who said that he was, sitting there white-knuckled, and as soon as they hopped out of the vehicle, they started shooting, they've never played that again. They've never even touched the Andrew Brown story again. And I have to see that as kind of a sign as, oh crap, we messed up on this one. Let's just hope people forget about it. And this is why we shouldn't rush to judgment. We should wait to hear all of the facts. I saved this podcast. I had been listening to it since March. There were things that they said that I was like, whoa, what are you talking about? And then when I got to this one, and it really inspired me to create my own show. When I got to April 27th and I heard this woman, their attorney, I heard her talk about the incident. I hadn't seen any coverage. I had read a couple of articles about it. I had seen a couple of news segments on it. And when NPR played this, I automatically thought to myself, that's not the full story. And if it is the true story, then those officers need to be locked up and go away for a long time. But I just have trouble believing. I have cop friends, and I just have trouble believing seeing them get out of their vehicle and just automatically start shooting. And on April 27th, after I listened to this Up First podcast, I saved this episode. And this was before, like I said, I saw any coverage. I just knew that this was not the full truth. And attempting to look at it from a progressive side, if we do want honest media, if we're going to try to hold our media accountable and restrict what is, quote, news and what are big lies, and we're going to silence certain people because we're worried about what might happen, is there any way that we should be allowed to blame this attorney for any violence or destruction of property that happened in Elizabeth City, North Carolina? Is there anyone else out there who agree with me that this might not be the full truth? And maybe they should have come out and said that the coverage has been released and you can go watch it and make your own decision and possibly leave a link in their description like I'm going to do that leads you to that coverage where you're able to watch it in your own decision. Or how about when they did all the interviews in North Carolina of individuals saying that if you don't have anything to hide, release the tape? How about they could have said, hey, it's North Carolina law that a judge has to approve that. They didn't say that. And then they never came back and made the corrections. They never pointed anybody to any articles saying, if you want to learn more, read more, here's where you can go. They just played that clip, and they played the interviews of the individuals asking for the tape, and they made it sound like that was what was actually happening down there. I believe it was deceptive. Now, please don't misinterpret what I'm saying. I am not trying to defend the police, criticize the police, defend Andrew Brown, criticize Andrew Brown. I think the best case scenario of this entire situation would have resulted in no death, no violence. What I'm simply trying to point out is the lack of accountability we have for our media. I have seen other people and other news outlets held to a higher standard than NPR. I would like to hear this attorney's perspective. Maybe this attorney, this is honestly what she truly believes. This is honestly what she thought she saw. However, NPR's job, if you're going to claim to report the news, you should show both sides of the story. And I would have liked to hear the Up First host describe the incident in their own words, or at least let their audience know that the footage from the officer's body camera was available to the public. That should have been a news story. That should have been on the Upfirst podcast. I would think that day or the following day that would have been important to them. They spent so much time on this case, rightfully so. Rightfully so. And should we hold NPR to a higher standard since they receive compensation from the government, from our tax dollars? CNN and Fox News are their own entities, and we expect them to be biased and have biased opinions. But it's difficult for me to listen to this Upfirst podcast and them not claim bias, them proclaim that they are factual and non-biased, and then see instances like this. And I have multiple of them, but to see instances like this and not feel deceived, it's difficult for me to do that. But who knows? Maybe one day NPR will make the correction. In the words of Steve Inskeep,
You know that NPR reporters stay on a story long enough to tell it the right way, sometimes weeks, sometimes months, or in this case, 20 years.
and with a disclaimer like that, how could you ever be wrong? I'm going to leave a link in my description to the NPR podcast that I've been referencing, that specific episode. Also, the Hodge twins did a great job discussing and breaking down the Andrew Brown story. And I agree with about 98% of the stuff that they said. So I'm also going to include a link to that in my description as well. And I would encourage you to go check it out. And unlike NPR, I'm also going to leave a link where you can go watch the body cameras yourself and make your own decision. Please remember, the coverage is a little graphic. It is an individual losing his life. But no offense, if you haven't watched the coverage or at least heard about the story from numerous different angles, then your opinion really doesn't hold a lot of water in my eyes. I can be found on YouTube, wherever you get your podcast, and I am launching a Facebook page. So all you have to do is pull up one of those apps, search the Chubby Caucasian Christian Closet Conservative, and look for my eagle. A relative of mine, Robin Brown, painted that eagle, and I loved it so much that she gave me the original. So go check out some of her other beautiful creations on her Redbubble account. You search Robin N. Brown. I'm also going to leave a link to her shop in my description as well. Go check it out. She's very talented, a lot of beautiful work. Wherever you're listening today, remember to subscribe, share, like, rate, and comment. I want to hear your opinion. And until next time, we will see you later.